I'd like to talk about the observation of consciousness. Can consciousness be observed? I would say that consciousness is observation. Consciousness is a process of observation, whereas self and the one is a process of meditation. I think that consciousness is fundamentally part of the psyche, so it's a psychic process, and by implication it's a thought process and it's an imaginative process. So thought and imagination is really the same thing, and I would say a prime example of that is the dream. I think the dream's imaginative. I think in the dream you're observing, and the dream itself is a process of thought. In the movement of thought, in the movement of observation, in the movement of consciousness and imagination, there is no specific sense of time, and therefore the process of consciousness is transformative, in the same way that imagination isn't really synonymous with time. I think imagination implies that you can do anything you like with time and space, as you find in science fiction, and you find in dreams and visions. So imagination creates hypothetical contexts. So in the imagination, the scientist uses thought in terms of knowledge and constructs the idea of a quantum theory. So that is as much a process of thought and imagination as, say, a story about the Grail legend. So you imagine the Grail legend based on language, based on symbol and myth, and therefore you in the same way you concoct a fantasy of studying the material process and theorizing about the quantum field. Or you build a space rocket and you send it to the moon. They're both narratives, they're both imaginative, they're both based on thought and knowledge. And all of this comes under the heading culture. So human beings in their consciousness are culture-bearing animals, as it were, or beings, as it were. So if you're sitting quiet, as they say in meditation, because if you look up in the Oxford English Dictionary, OED, you'll find that meditation basically is to ponder, which means you could say to reflect in depth, to delve or probe into. And I suppose you could also say analyze and contemplate. It's looking deeply into things. So you look deeply into a book. When you read a book, you're really meditating on the book. You're thinking deeply about the book. You're feeling, sensing, intuiting deeply about the book. So consciousness, in a sense, which has invented the book, so the book is imagined by consciousness, the piece of music is imagined by consciousness, and the mathematical theory is imagined by consciousness. And in all of that, you're observing a phenomenon that thought and consciousness and imagination has cooked up. So really there seems to be a close connection between observation and meditation. But I'm using observation strictly in terms of consciousness and meditation in terms of spiritual awareness. But in both cases, in essence, observation and meditation are not based on time. You can tell a story in time, and it takes time to think about a mathematical problem. But the process of reflection, the process of accessing the memory and using the computational nature of memory and all the permutations of experience and knowledge within the memory is not a linear process as such, it's not a time process as such. So when I'm walking down the river and I'm in the spiritual dimension, as it were, of the self or the one, then I'm in a state of meditation, and there's no reference to the body and to consciousness. So I can walk in meditation and not really be caught up in my thinking or caught up in what I'm actually looking at as a series of impressions like trees and river and sky and birds and other animals, which is a kind of fragmentation in the sense that in the physical world we differentiate into a kind of duality, whereas in consciousness, in thought, we're usually involved in integration and unity. We're bringing things together in our mind. We're telling a narrative. We're stringing fragmentary experiences, fragmentary knowledge, and fragmentary language into some kind of integration so that we can comprehend a very disintegrated narrative or a very disintegrated experience as you walk along the river. In the dialogues of Krishnamurti and Professor David Bohm, their main thrust really is about the problem of thought. And in their estimation, somewhere in prehistory, when we were more, you might say, physical based, before language, etc., and we were just hunting for food, when we began to think, then what they say is that was taking a wrong turn. In thought, we you might say, distorted the kind of realism of knowing what we're doing, of thinking straight, of observing the facts. So they're saying that on one level, consciousness is working well when observing facts. So you're walking down the river, you know where you're going, you know what you're looking at. You come home, you cook food, and you make some pottery, etc. You know what you're doing is very realistic and so forth. But once you're distracted by thought in the imagination, you might say, to a certain degree, and you become what they say is psychological, then you're deceiving yourself. You're living in a kind of idealism. You're living in a kind of abstraction. In other words, there's no real intrinsic order. It's unrealistic, it's incomprehensible. And they both agree that you have to observe the source of the confusion and psychological disorder within consciousness by observing thought. Now I'm saying consciousness and thought are the same thing, and so are they. But they're saying there is no psychic dimension, and I think there is a psychic dimension quite different from the physical dimension. Therefore, consciousness, psyche, is not reducible to the brain, whereas they think it is simply a material process. And I am also saying that you can't actually observe thought. There's no way that you can sit quietly and observe thought. Consciousness being thought means that yes, you can notice various thoughts. I mean, if I'm remembering about walking down by the river, I can remember that. Or I'm remembering what I read in a book. Or I'm remembering a dream last night. And I think, yes, you can observe that. You can see your memory producing those thoughts, or those thoughts are producing memories. But I think the memory and thought are really working together, obviously, and you could say that whatever you think is always based on what you're remembering. So even if you're not conscious of remembering, subconsciously, in order to think what you think and do what you do and make the choices, you're already thinking that, you're already subconsciously doing that. So if you're sitting and you think, you know, you're going to go into the kitchen and make some food, that's not just happening by itself. You're not just simply, oh, I'll go in the kitchen and have food. No, there's a sense already that you want to go in the kitchen and make food. Or if you plan to go for a walk, you're already, before you're thinking that, you're already moving in that direction. You're already intending to do that. So when you learn to ride a bike, and you can ride the bike very well, so you go out and you get on the bike and you start riding the bike. But you're not thinking of all the mechanisms about learning to ride the bike. You're just simply riding the bike. So when you go into the kitchen, you're not thinking about what the kitchen is and how to make a cup of tea or something. So I'm saying that you're already, throughout the day, you're already anticipating what you're going to do and what you're going to think. So in a sense, you could say consciousness is always a continuity of thought, is always a continuity of experience, is always a continuity of memory and its associations. So if it was possible to record the conscious and unconscious or subconscious thought process throughout the day, then it would be a kind of narrative where you begin the day and you end the day, and there are episodes or different pages of a book or chapters of a book, and at the end of the day you recollect and you reflect and you do a review of the day, that kind of thing. And then when you dream, there might be a kind of pastiche of what you've been through in the day. So any amount of observation of thought, language, memory is not going to free you from consciousness. Krishnamurti and Professor David Bowen say that through observation you can, in a sense, dismantle the psychological problem of self-deception. So that what we call psychological problems within and without, in terms of one's personality and society around you, all the conflicts, all the disorder, all the violence, all of that kind of thing, can be dissolved in your consciousness by observing consciousness, by observing trains of thought, by observing thought itself, and therefore freeing yourself from that psychological aspect of the brain or psychological aspect of consciousness. I'm saying none of that is possible. No amount of observing will actually change any fundamental structure in the brain or in consciousness. And because I don't see consciousness in the sense of thought in the brain at all, I think that thought and consciousness is actually part of the psychic process. I mean, whatever goes on in the brain, biochemically, I think, yes, there is a connection. But I wouldn't say it's a connection where thought is reducible to the brain. When I'm sitting here now and I'm thinking what I'm thinking about thought and consciousness, and as I was looking out of the window just now, and I wasn't thinking, I wasn't using my memory, and I had a sense of thought as a kind of emptiness or silence, and you could say that from that silence of memory, that silence of thinking, then that absence of thinking, you might say an absence of memory, meant that the psyche or thought or consciousness was simply silent and empty. And then, of course, in terms of the one, the mind, the self and meditation, then you could say that there is a reflection within thought and consciousness and psyche which mirrors the silence and openness and freedom within the state of meditation or the one. And then by implication you can say, when I look out of the window now, the light in the sky or the light in the air around me, the light and the space is open and empty, and then thought and consciousness is open and empty, and then the meditation of the one, the mind, is open and empty, and those three levels, you might say synchronistically or correspondingly, reflect each other, I think is quite interesting. So you could say that if you're a materialist and you didn't regard the psyche as being in a different dimension or the spiritual being a different dimension, then the openness and emptiness and silence of the world around you could be seen as something spiritual or something psychic. But you don't have to use those terms. So you could write poetry about it, you could compose music about it, you could put it in a novel, and you could explain it scientifically, and it would still be valid. In the same way, in consciousness, you could say, and the psyche, if you felt that it was in a different dimension, and the imagination, then you could write a poem about that. You could compose music, and you could write a novel about the silence and emptiness of the physical level and the psychic level. And then if you have spiritual awareness, and you're looking at it from that point of view, as I'm saying, then I can see all three levels mirroring each other. And a similar kind of awareness is applicable to each of the levels. So it really doesn't matter whether you're a materialist or you're like Carl Jung, you believe in the psyche, you believe that the human being, in terms of the personality, is centered in the psychic dimension, or like myself, you think the self is in the spiritual dimension, then it really doesn't matter what your worldview is. You can have either worldview. You can combine the three, you can combine two, or you could separate them off into their own levels. It doesn't really matter. So in consciousness, I think the idea of freedom can be experienced as a kind of silence and openness of thought. But I think generally speaking, the kind of freedom people feel in their psyche and consciousness is really through the imagination, which is based on a kind of creative impulse. So you could say people are most free in their consciousness when they're imagining, when they're being creative. And for some people that's very desirable. They want to be free to imagine what they want. They want to be creative and invent new things. For people the materialist or more in the physical dimension, you might say in one sense you like to travel and you like to explore the material universe, and you paint landscapes, and all of the cultural expressions can be looked at materialistically or in the sense of consciousness and the brain as synonymous. Therefore all of culture and consciousness is material anyway. But I think in the end it really doesn't matter whether you're prone to scientific thought or you might say more psychic based thought, or you're interested in the spiritual nature of the one. So I would say that what is called thought isn't limited to consciousness. Consciousness in the human being, in the sense of what you remember, what you're thinking, etc., and the psychology you use in relationship to other people and the basic everyday world, that's a very specific kind of thought, which is based on the structure we call consciousness. But I think if you look at the psyche as a whole and you think thought is involved in the psyche, then thought certainly, you might say, can expand way beyond consciousness. And what allows you to dream and to have a vision or even go on astral journeys is that in your consciousness, wherever you go in the psyche, you can go there because you might say you're dependent on thought. So it's the same way. You can fly around the world, but you're dependent on the air, you're dependent on the space and the air. So you can go anywhere in the plane. So in your consciousness you can go in a dream, you can travel, astral travel, because you're travelling in the medium of thought or psyche. In meditation in the one, because it's pure emptiness, then the self in meditation, in one sense, doesn't go anywhere, doesn't travel anywhere, because wherever self is, it's always one. There is no medium that you can identify, like matter or energy or psyche or psychic energy and thought and that kind of thing. In the one, you can't describe a process. So you can say it's simplicity, openness, freedom, oneness. So I think that consciousness is a product of the dimension of the psyche, and therefore the thought is not limited to the brain. The thought in some way may interface with the brain in some way, but it's not reducible to the brain. So as I'm sitting here now and using my thought and language, I think that consciousness is localized where I'm sitting in my physical body. And if I went to sleep and I immediately went into a dream or I saw visual images or apparitions, and I'm just lying in bed, then that means that there is a proximity of the dream to the physical body lying in the bed. You know, if you look at it in terms of space and time, then you're shifting in a sense from one dimension to another in a matter of seconds, or there's a continuity, so you could be in a dream and you wake up and you could be projecting apparitions and images around you in the room. That often happens to me. So you can see the apparitions in the room, and when you go to sleep you see the dream images. So that means to say that your thought, in a way, your psyche, can manifest in the physical world, and therefore it can project. And that's often said that what thought does, what the psyche does, is actually project. Now, when I'm looking at the castle through the window now, my consciousness, I'm saying, is localized around my body, and therefore I don't see consciousness in the castle, in the sky, in the sun, in the planets, in the stars. I don't see consciousness in the physical universe other than localized around the body of a conscious organism or a conscious being or an intelligent organism. So the idea of cosmic consciousness, I think, is a kind of misnomer or redundant idea. I think there is telepathy. So two people in the room, and I'm saying their consciousness is localized around their body, as it were. Yet I think there are signals, what's called the psi field, PSI, the psychic field, does go on between two individual consciousnesses, where you pick up signals. You pick up the psi signal and it transmits information. Just like the BBC is broadcasting, say, from London, broadcasting signals, and you pick it up on the radio. But the BBC in London and all its operations isn't connected to where I am now. Only the signal is sent and picked up through the radio. So I'm saying that the consciousness is in London and the consciousness is here, and you're picking up the signal, the radio and the transmitter and the receiver. So there is only a signal. There's a electrical field, as it were, or whatever you want to say, electromagnetic field. And so, yes, I think there is like a psychic field. And I think in that way, That's not the same as saying the universe is conscious. In that sense, I think it's simply a signal. So I've had experiences like that, so I'm pretty sure that they're real and true. Now, synchronicity is another example where you have a dream, a precognitive dream, and then the next day that dream comes true. And if you have it many, many times, I mean, my whole life has been, I've had thousands of synchronicities, so I'm pretty sure they're real and true. And how do you explain having a dream in your consciousness and then something in the world around you corresponds to that? You know, in other words, you dream of a particular bird and you're out walking and then you see this same bird and you feel it's a synchronicity, and you could say, well, the signal that came that was in the dream was also next day in the physical world. And again, that would be what you might call the psi field, or sending a signal. A bit like a telephone. Someone calls you on the telephone or something like that. When you're in meditation in the one, it's irrelevant what's going on physically, it's irrelevant what's going on psychically, because neither of those fields, as it were, the electromagnetic field and the psychic field, actually interferes with the one. Because as I say, the one is empty. There are no conditions, there are no fields, there are no processes in the one. It's a completely different thing. I mean, if you think of the planet, and there are over 7.23 billion people all existing on the planet, globally speaking, and all their consciousnesses are localized. And I think that localization of consciousness creates the reality of the person, the individual person. So within a family, each person is highly individual. Not only do they look different, but their character is different, their interests are different, their reactions, their responses, their feelings, their thoughts, everything about them, by implication, is different. So they're highly unique. And I think that the 20th century, politically speaking, you might say, allowed for more people to be highly individual in the way they express themselves, in different things like music and art and their free speech, So on every level, people were encouraged to be more individual, and then people become quite negative and say, well, everyone's an individualist, and there was individualism, and that broke up the community, it broke up the collective sense of people together in religion, in the sense of national identity, all of that. But I don't see it that way. I don't think that's the case. I don't think people are necessarily more selfish or self-interested because they're individual. I think I look at the world not as 7.3 billion people as a human species, but I look at that as individuals. So if you think of solving the world's problems, I don't think of a kind of en masse solution to a problem, like if everyone believed in God, or if everyone believed in the state, or everyone believed in materialism, or everyone believed in any particular ideology or idealistic state. I don't think that you can really change people and change society by imposing on the individual any form of collective ideas. I think that the change in the wider society has to come out of the individual. So if there's a problem where groups of people are fighting, say, then whatever's causing those groups of people to fight, I would say that they're not fighting as individuals. They're not fighting as independent people with their own personality, their own unique thoughts. So I would say that they're fighting for a cause, an ideal cause, or a dogma, or an ideology. So they're not free individuals living, you might say, in the modern period, but they're conditioned by, you might say, belief systems of the past. So I would say that when I was growing up, for example, pretty much all the people I was living with in a kind of basic community, I think there was a high sense of individuality in that, as persons, as people. However, this was, after the World War II in the 1940s, and my father and his family, his brothers and all of his friends, they all fought in the war. So again, they're acting as a group mind, and they were under the control, you might say, of the British government. They had to, if they didn't fight for the country, for the English identity or whatever, then they would have been put in prison. And I think in the First World War, they would have been killed. Now, when they fought in the war, they were under the control of a group idea, a group mind, as it were. And what they call a hive mind or a herd instinct, which is territorial and protective and defensive. And that ideology of the British government that controlled the national identity, you might say, they could justify the war that they fought. They would find good reasons why those individual people should be herded together in order to fight a war. And those individual people that were conscientious objectors, you know, they individually refused to fight in the war, and they're put in prison. And it seems there were relatively few individuals that absconded from the war, as it were. So in the 20th century, when there was a high level of individuality emerging in the very early part of the 20th century, after that there were 2 world wars where people collectively, in terms of a group mind or a national identity, they sacrificed themselves justifiably in the war. But if you look at any national identity of, say, the Germans that fought in the war, most of those individual people fighting in the war, they felt they were justified by their government to fight in the war. So on both sides, most of the people that were fighting in the war and that were killed in the war felt they were justified to fight the war because their national government said it's a just war. So what happens when literally millions of individual people are under the control of an ideology or a belief system or a group identity? I mean, psychologically, it's probably not true that those people are frightened of the government or frightened of disagreeing with the government. I don't think that's actually why millions of people, or millions of men, as it were, mostly men, you know, went to fight in the war. I don't think it was out of fear. I don't think that's the case. I don't think it was a psychological thing at all. You could say on a level of principle, it was more to do with good and evil. You know, in other words, the British are good and the Germans are evil. Which is a very Christian religious point of view. What you might call dualistic. But my father, say, and his family and friends, they weren't religious. So they weren't religiously thinking of good and evil, but nonetheless, the indoctrination by the government would have been that the Nazis are evil and we're fighting for the good, it's a just war. Whereas for me, if I look at that situation with my particular perspective, I don't see people in terms of good and evil. So if I was told that, I wouldn't go along with that analysis. I wouldn't analyse the human personality in limited terms of good and evil. I think the ideas of good and evil are products of thought and imagination, and therefore they're really fantasies. And as I say, putting a man on the moon is a fantasy, the quantum field is a fantasy. The various cathedrals are fantasies. Anything cultural is essentially a fantasy, a product of the imagination, which Jung would say is symbolic and mythological. So you could say what we do on the surface of the earth in terms of society, culture and civilization is really a fantasy. And you could say, in one sense, that the very content of consciousness and thought and imagination is a fantasy. So in a dream, which you might say is a very good expression of fantasy, in a dream, anything can happen. Hypothetically, literally anything could happen in a dream. So that subconsciously, every night, throughout the night, every single human being that's ever lived within the human species and the human drama is really subject to fantasy. And then when you wake up, that fantasy, you might say, in terms of, say, rational thought, conscious rational thought, that people living in the world and say mathematicians and astrophysicists, they think that rational thought, that rational imagination, that rational understanding isn't fantasy, but in fact it is fantasy. And if you look at thought, consciousness, imagination, dream, as a stream of consciousness, and as I just said, when you're asleep, you're dreaming, you wake up and you're still having images while you're lying in bed, and then you might see images in the room, apparitions. Therefore there's a continuity of consciousness, i.e. a continuity of fantasy. And so in the world, you have the persona, the mask. Everybody's wearing a mask. And the mask is an expression of your personality, and personality is the psyche. In the psyche is the personality. So wherever you go in the psyche, dreams, visions, astral journeys, near-death experience, the land of the dead, the land of the ancestors, it's all personality. And all personality is an invention of thought and imagination. That is the psyche, that is consciousness. And that's the world we live in. So we go to the theatre and we watch a play, and that play could be a play of, say, ancient Rome. It could be a play of the Renaissance period. It could be a medieval play, it could be a modern play. Or you go to the fairground, you go to the circus, you go to listen to music, you go into a mathematical institute and think about numbers and patterns of meaning and numbers. It's all fantasy. And in that field of fantasy, in that field of consciousness, in that field of psyche, whether you're alive or dead and you're in the land of the dead and you die and you go into the psyche, all of that consciousness, wherever you go you're conscious, so you're in that consciousness, there is no escape from fantasy, there's no freedom from delusion, there's no freedom from the whole spectrum of good and evil, the whole spectrum of war and peace, the whole spectrum of realism and idealism, because it's all a product of your thought. So if you live in the animal kingdom, if you were simply a physical animal, human animal, then you wouldn't have the problem of consciousness. And if you were in a self, in the one mind, you would have no problem with consciousness. And that's why they say in Tibetan Buddhism that Buddha was liberated from the conditioning process of consciousness. Or that he at least understood there was an alternative, even though when he came back into his body from a transcendental dimension, he still had to live in the world. He still lived with his family and friends. He was a teacher of wisdom. He still communicated. He still had his memory and his behavior. But he knew that where he was looking from, his perspective, his understanding, and his realization was that there was an alternative both to the physical universe and the psychic universe. That means from the body and the psyche. And that's a matter of choice. The individual today, they can read about materialism, they can read about religion, spirituality, culture, humanism. They can read about anything they like, and each individual makes a choice, and they're free as an individual to make a choice. So if you want to be interested in Buddhism, you can be interested in Buddhism. If you want to be interested in artificial intelligence and robots and things like that, then you're free to choose that. If you want to cut off from this or cut off from that and not be interested in the psyche or the spiritual, it's perfectly you're free as an individual to do that. But whatever you do in your consciousness is still based on fantasy. And all fantasy is a stream of consciousness. And in a sense, it's just like society. In society, everybody has their opinion about everything. We all have opinion about the politicians, about celebrities, and such. But they're only opinions within the fabric of society, just like you wear a mask within the fabric of consciousness, which is the same. So inwardly and outwardly is still the fabric of image making. From the perspective of the mind, the self does not make choices from the perspective of the one. But in consciousness, you're always making choices. So if I'm in the one and I feel free in the one, I still have to make choices in my consciousness. So I have to play the game whether I like it or not. I mean, even though I can be quiet and my consciousness is not distracting me, and I may not look at the world as good and evil, and I may not look at the world in many different ways, but I'm still in the world, I still use consciousness, and therefore I am implicated in the world of fantasy. But I realise it is a fantasy. And there is no ultimate right and ultimate wrong, or good and evil within the fantasy. But relatively speaking, you can say, if England thought they were good and they thought the Nazis were evil, that's the perspective, that's the ideology, that's the belief system in that particular context. And everybody had to suffer along with that. And in the Middle East, they've got their context, and all the people there have to suffer along with that kind of conflict. And if you're in a family and things aren't working out, then within that context you have to suffer the conflict. But in the end, it's all a matter of opinion or psychological projection of images and fantasy. In other words, consciousness is rooted in fantasy, in imagination. So an artist will access their fantasy, their imagination, and then extract a particular picture, say, of their fantasy world, their consciousness world, and that will be a limited context, and it will depict a particular coherent scene. So out of the flux of fantasy, the cultural person will manifest a particular piece of music. So politically, out of the Middle East and all the flux and confusion in the Middle East, decisions will be made within specific contexts. But the overall drama of the Middle East, no one's in control of that. It's coming out of the, you might say, the source of fantasy within each person that's projected into the world and in essence is incoherent, but individual people, individual groups, they mastermind the context and decide that you're good and you're good or evil, and that is the context the conscious mind is projecting out of the fantasy. As I say, you go into every night, everybody goes into the dream world, which is pretty much a world of fantasy, but reflects the conscious world. And when they wake up, they use language and they use ideas and they use images and numbers and science and politics and psychology, but it's still based on the dream, it's still based on the imagination and fantasy. So a scientist that's thinking about the string theory, the multi-dimensional string theory, or thinking about multiverses or deeper levels of the quantum field, they're using exactly the same imagination to do their work. And then sometimes solutions to problems in mathematics, the mathematician has a dream where they see a possible solution to the problem in their dream. So there's all these layers, you might say, of consciousness, from the unconscious to the subconscious to the conscious. And they're all, it's really all one consciousness on whatever level you work. So in the sense of the functions of consciousness, you can be aware of the sensory world in the physical body, you can be aware of your feelings, you can be aware of your intuition, or you can be aware of your intellect. And they could all work together, they can work separately. But at the deepest level of the psyche, it's an undifferentiated fantasy, which is a kind of flux and chaos. So I think the only thing we can do in terms of the problems within consciousness and the actual problem of consciousness itself as being a fantastic drama, is that the only thing we can do is individually live through that. There's no escape from it. We have to live through it. We're born into an animal body that's based on the instincts of sexuality, reproduction, aggression, emotionality, all kinds of biorhythms of waking and sleeping, etc. And we have to deal with that in the physical sense, and all the violence that ensues out of that aggressive instinct, as it were. And the same way in conscious, we have to deal with the fantasy, the delusion, which is conflated with the instincts and aggression and violence. So really, psychophysically, you can't separate them within yourself. And then if you're interested in spirituality, then again that's an individual choice, and what motivates you to do that is very individual, etc. But it is a choice, and you live in the world that you choose to live in a sense. But whatever that choice is, wherever you live in the world, that microcosm in which you live, that localized consciousness or even localized dream state, is not separate from the whole stream of consciousness. That is the fantasy we call culture, the fantasy we call civilization in history, i.e. the fantasy of the Homo sapien. So coming from another planet to this planet, you could say that we're fantasists. And as Shakespeare says, a tale told by an idiot, a kind of madness, a kind of insanity. However rational, I think fundamentally consciousness is really rooted in the irrational. As I say, however rational you become, and however much in control of the mathematics of the universe or the mathematics of the computer, is still fantasy, and there's no escape.